Hello and welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast. Each week, we take a look at what's going on in the news and talk about how ancient history can help us understand the world around us.
This week, we'll be talking about food in the ancient world. Edible, inedible, you name it, they ate it. Since we're called Against the Law, L-O-R-E, you might hear a gavel going off from time to time. But don't worry, no one's being sentenced. We're just trying to challenge an assumption or common mistake about something in the ancient world. I'm Barney, and I'll be kicking off this tasty episode today, feeding you hearty history fodder and generally picking the low-hanging fruit. Be sure to listen out for the Babylonian bell, which will go whenever I realise I can shoehorn something Mesopotamian into the conversation. If you're very lucky, we'll get a Sumerian scream. Joining me today are Alison, Flo, and Stop Thief! Halt right there, criminal scum! Reveal yourself! Oh, it's Xenia, skulking around and trying to sneak in a mention of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. So keep your ears open. It would be a tragedy to miss it. Speaking of which, Alison's here and ready with some delicious tidbits about food culture in ancient Greece. I honestly can't say whether we'll get a mention of her favourite theatrical topics, but if tragedy comes up, you'll know about it. Finally, we've got Flo, who'll be asking questions to keep the rest of us from monologuing, like I am now. Last week, Flo reminded us that her power comes from knowing that she knows nothing. But today, I'm reminded of the words of Nietzsche, that a person of knowledge must not only be able to love their enemies, but also hate their friends. With Flo's burning hatred in mind, let's kick things off. We've had a major culinary history discovery announced recently. Has anyone seen the news?
I've seen it. It's like a takeaway in Pompeii, I want to say. I might be wrong, but it's like a takeaway stand for food, and it's got paintings on the outside of sort of try before you buy with your eyes. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are already quite a few that have been discovered in Pompeii, but this new one is really special because it's got, as you say, Flo, all these beautiful paintings on the outside with like chickens on them, because presumably there was some chicken stew in there. They had these big vats just sort of sitting in a counter in these fast food shops in Pompeii. And what you do is you go up to the counter and you'd point at whichever stew in the vat you wanted, and then it would be scooped up and put in a nice disposable pottery bowl.
Pottery?
Yeah, it was unglazed. So the unglazed pottery is just sort of pottery that's dried but hasn't had a special, they call it slip. It goes over the top and it sort of seals in all of the pottery so that it's waterproof and mostly chip-proof, and it just sort of protects the pottery a bit more. But if you were making cheap pottery, you'd not glaze it. So that sometimes food or oil or whatever would like seep into the pottery, which means that you can't really use it again because it's got food which might rot in it, and then it goes all disgusting. So yeah, it was disposable pottery. You pop in your food and then you throw away the bowl afterwards.
All across the UK in archaeological digs, they find these great, obviously I'm a big fan of sewers and ditches and things. In ditches, you see hundreds and hundreds of shards or sherds, don't know which is the right word, of these pots that are just one use only, all chucked away in one rubbish heap in a ditch.
Is it more sustainable to like yeet a bowl against the wall than it is to put some paper in the bin?
I'll test that theory at home and see how well it goes down after dinner. I'll just chuck it against the wall and see what my other half does.
I like the idea, Alison, that if you were handed a disposable pottery bowl, you would have to smash it just on principle.
Yeah, the temptation would be too strong not to. What else do you do with it, though? They just like stack up in the corner and then you've just got like some kind of art installation that looks a bit wobbly.
Instead of taking out the recycling at the end of the week, they've got to smash the bowls.
Yeah.
I seem to remember I went up to stay in Haltwhistle a couple of years ago, and there was a preserved amphora, I want to say, of garum, and I've heard that it's quite disgusting, but I can't remember what was in it.
So Haltwhistle being on Hadrian's Wall, right?
Yeah.
My favourite, Hadrian. So the garum, that was something that they had to get shipped in to Britain from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, because it wasn't a very popular thing in ancient Britain, but it was very popular in the Roman Empire. So it was basically fish sauce made from rotting fish guts, which were left to rot in the sun in between layers of salt and herbs for up to 3 months. And then the remaining whatever was left in that vat would be like drained out. They had these special filters at the bottom, so all the liquid would drain out, and that was like the top quality garum, or sometimes it was called liquamen. They also used the pasty stuff that was left in the vats after the liquid had poured out, and that was called alec. So that was like almost like a marmite type fish paste that you could spread on toast.
Ew.
But yeah, they had garum with literally everything. They had it on porridge, loads of recipes that have come down to us from Roman times. They list garum in almost every single recipe. Like one of the simplest recipes is just fried eggs with garum on top. Yum.
Well, garum, you either love it or you hate it. That's what they say.
And the Romans loved it.
So yeah, garum sounds a bit disgusting to me. Is there anything in Barney and Alison in your worlds that's to do with gross fishy minging meals?
Well, I know they've done quite a lot of work trying to reconstruct ingredients from the old Babylonian period. There's an Akkadian word, Akkadian being the language that they spoke and wrote in much of ancient Mesopotamia, called siku, siqqu, which they think might be similar to garum, as it's sort of a fermented fish brine, but it also might have used locusts as well.
Protein.
Really good protein, right? Sustainable protein. But it's interesting how you get into finding these things, because there's a few dedicated food tablets from ancient Babylonia, but sometimes it's easier to reconstruct recipes and references from literature as well, just like people expressing themselves as you would with your whole variety of cultural reference. So last week I brought up Enuma Elish, which is the creation myth of Babylonia, and in that the big baddie is the goddess, or sort of the primordial chaos called Tiamat, is killed by their hero god Marduk, and he says that he wants to split her in two like a fish to be dried, and so you can tell from that they were actively drying fish in ancient Mesopotamia, and it's something that they still do in Iraq today. There's a dish called mazgoof, which is like a fish split down the middle. So it's nice when you see that continuity, and also that these references were being used in all kinds of literature as well as in specific recipes.
Barney, that's really interesting. So we've essentially had this way of preserving fish survives through essentially an ancient insult. Am I right? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, but I mean, she's already dead at the time, so it's one of those like, just leave it, like she's already gone. But yeah, it's more like it's the kind of the destruction of this chaotic primordial deity creates the world out of her body. So it's even more fundamental than that. If you'd like to think of the world we're living in today as two halves of a split open dried fish, then you're on the same page as the Babylonians.
Fish and locusts. I think I'd probably, if I was transported back in time, I'd probably pretend to be vegetarian.
Yeah, in truth, I might do the same, Flo. That is something that was practiced in ancient Greece. I think more famously, it was definitely practiced in Asia. So, for example, early Hinduism, early Buddhism tended to be big into vegetarianism. However, it was a thing that was practiced in Greece. It was just a lot less popular and tended to get a bit of stick from the comedians who would kind of poke fun at people who were vegetarians. And it tended to be if you followed very specific religious cults. There's one called Orphism, which is based on the myth of Orpheus, which the famous Broadway and West End musical Hadestown is based on. They were big into vegetarianism, but it was a lot less common at the time.
Speaking of other diets, nowadays we have the so-called paleo diet, and that's supposed to be ancient grains and things. If I think about ancient food, I'm always thinking about wheat, rye, barley, other grains like that. Am I right in thinking that people would have had those crops across Europe and across the ancient Near East?
Yeah, definitely. So in ancient Greece, they had wheat and barley. They had also a lot of the kind of domestic birds that we would keep today, like chickens, geese. Food is really interesting because it tends to reflect a culture. And it's fascinating that in kind of the same way that the ancient Greeks often praised moderation in kind of everything, they didn't like things to be too excessive. This is partly due to their historical war with ancient Persia, and the way in which they kind of othered the Persian Empire, which they saw as being more excessive. So, for example, we think of the Spartans as being particularly regimented in kind of war and in life. And in the same way, their food was famously kind of okay, but not great, like pretty plain. So not the kind of Greek food that we think of today that is like these amazing flavors of like Greek salad and feta and tzatziki. It's pretty boring food, unfortunately.
I definitely know that there's one brilliant scholar, French scholar from the middle of the 20th century who tried to deconstruct a lot of Babylonian recipes. And he said that he wouldn't wish those recipes on his worst enemies.
Yeah, okay, that's shifted the ancient Near East out of favour then, for me at least.
You've got to think like some of it must be nice. I don't know if this is true or if this is just something that I've heard kind of in the media or in kind of representations of Rome. But is it true that the Romans would sometimes eat a lot and then make themselves sick to eat more later?
Yeah, that is quite extreme behaviour. I'll just caveat it with that, but it was known to happen at the particularly grand feasts, especially because big dinners were a really important social networking occasion. You'd want to be able to stay and you'd want to be able to appreciate the food. So yeah, it had happened.
Is it true that Romans lay down on their left-hand side to eat at feasts?
Yes, it is. It was called reclining. So they had these couches, which were sort of like chaise longues, if you've seen those in sort of posh country houses. And they would lie down and then they would eat the food with just one hand. So a lot of Roman cuisine is sort of finger food or on little cocktail, well, not the kind of cocktail sticks we might know today, but it was sort of cocktail stick type food, stuff that you could very easily pick out with your hand. They once found in an excavation a table that had like little dips in one side of the table, and they think that might have been for putting sort of tiny little hors d'oeuvres along the edge of the table so that you could just pick it out of the table itself. Their serving ware was absolute genius, I have to say. They came up with really creative ways to serve food.
So that's my vote going for the Romans then, because I already, eat with one hand lying down on the sofa watching Netflix.
I was going to say, let me get this straight. When I eat a Malteser out of the cup holder at the cinema, because there's a convenient little hole next to me, I get told off for being gross and unhygienic. But the Romans get these nice little holes in their chaise longues and they're allowed to just eat out of them whenever they're at a party. It's not fair.
It's all right, Barney, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah, if you wanted more about grain and barley and stuff like that, look no further than the ancient Near East, because these are like the original grain gang. A lot of them were domesticated before recorded history started, but then it also caused the beginnings of settled society in the ancient Near East. Basically, you could pretty much say that like barley drove the rise of urbanism in Mesopotamia. This is pre-Babylonia. Probably what comes to be called Sumer. One of the reasons why people started to settle down in cities was that they had such a wealth of different foods, different biomes near major cities like Uruk, that people started to specialize, and so you become codependent. If one person's a fisherman, one person's a farmer, one person hunts and stuff like that, then not everyone can do enough to provide for their immediate family. And then once you get that, then you need people to organize it all, and so you start to get stratification in society, which is where you get hierarchy, and all of a sudden you need someone to write down how much food everyone's getting, so then you might as well invent writing, and then that's it, you just go from there.
Barney, I've heard of this thing called, I think it's called a bevel. Is it a bevel-shaped bowl or a bevel rim bowl? And that was supposed to be like where ancient slaves in Mesopotamia got their rations. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is a beveled rim bowl, and it's kind of like the disposable or at least unglazed pottery we were talking about earlier. They have a very distinctive shape, and because they only seem to come in a few standard sizes, sort of like small, medium, and large, or something like that. Archaeologists think that they were kind of mass produced in order to control ration sizes given to labourers.
That's interesting that you speak about standardization in the ancient world, because I think of that as being a very modern phenomenon. So, for example, Domino's pizzas, I know they have a very specific spoon to get a very specific amount of sauce on their pizzas. So it's like that same concept being used in the ancient world.
Definitely, yeah, no, definitely. Like, I think the origins of writing in Mesopotamia is all about standard metrics. Like, they had so many different kinds of measurements and so many different signs for all of these things, because writing basically evolved for administration for them. You needed someone to keep track of the number of sheep and the amount of yield from fields and stuff like that. And with all these different kinds of produce, they invented different signs for them. So the sign for cow looked like a cow, but the sign for sheep was a bit more abstract, for example. But these beveled rim bowls, they crop up in the sign list as well. So the sign for eat is an old pictogram with someone's mouth shaded in, and then the bowl placed right next to it.
That's really cool. So it was so popular that it became like an image for literally eating.
Yeah, it's like the image for food. It also means food as well, and ration. It's everywhere.
So speaking about workers and the food that they get, I have a memory of being at primary school and learning that ancient Egyptian pyramid builders were paid in beer and figs, and I thought that would be against the law because it sounded a bit dubious. I've since actually looked it up now here, and in ancient Egypt, apparently they were paid roughly 4 to 5 litres a day for building the pyramids, that seems like a lot to me now, because I think beer now is stronger. I think like wine, we used to, in the medieval period in the UK, we had small wine, which was used in lieu of drinking water because it had a lower alcohol percentage and you could drink it all day. I mean, they weren't hugely healthy, but you could drink it all day in lieu of dirty water. But 4 to 5 litres of beer a day building the pyramids, by the end of that, I'm such a lightweight, I'd be in trouble.
I would love to be paid in beer. I think if I had the option now, maybe part wages in beer. I'd probably leave the figs and just go some money, some beer. That would be nice.
Yeah, all the money's just going on beer anyway, so you might as well.
I'm actually trying to help. I'm trying to help the economy. I'm trying to help the company.
I'd actually probably rather be paid in Nando's. If I drop the vegetarian facade, my favourite meal is to have a cheeky Nando's. Stereotypical, I know, but yeah, I can't deny my love of the spicy chicken. Were there chickens around?
Yeah, definitely chickens in the ancient world. In fact, the chicken had a position kind of similar to turkeys do now for us. You know that our name for the bird that is a turkey comes from an association with the country Turkey.
No, I did not know that. What?
Okay, so it's quite confusing. Yeah, despite the fact that turkeys are from the New World and from America, apparently people thought they were from Turkey. So we call it it's like the turkey cock. Cock like cockerel, and that's why we call it turkey. But interestingly, in like France and Russia, they call it the Indian bird, so it's like Indiushka in Russian. So people think of it as coming from further east, basically. And they had the same thing with chickens. So the Sumerians called chickens the bird from Meluha, which they think might be the Indus Valley civilization. And then the Syrians, who are further west, called it the Akkadian bird. So everyone had a different name for this chicken because as it was domesticated, it was coming across from South Asia, where it was first domesticated from a jungle bird, red jungle bird, I think.
I'm really chuffed that I've learned that. Thanks, Barney.
That's so cool.
That's all right. I'll give you one final thing. The Egyptians called the chicken the bird that gives birth every day.
Oh.
I love that literally everyone was like, God knows where this bird came from. Like literally everyone's saying like, oh, it must be the bird from down the road.
Not my bird. But I don't think chickens ever appear in sacrifices or anything like that. I think they're a little bit more lowly than some of the sort of grander, richer meats that I think we associate with parts of the ancient world.
So for an animal to be sacrificed, did it have to be, I mean, I'm presuming sacrifice doesn't mean put on a spit and then enjoyed with some applesauce. I'm presuming you mean like it was sacrificed to the gods.
Yeah, they did have this myth, the Titan who brought fire to humans, Prometheus. He taught them to, when they cooked an animal, when they cooked meat, to just roast, to just put the bones and the fat, I think it was, and give that to the gods and burn that for the gods, so that they weren't actually giving the gods any of the meat and they could keep the meat for themselves. But the gods would smell this lovely scent of burning fat and bones and think that they had been sacrificed to a really lovely animal. But then people still got to eat the meat. Unfortunately, Prometheus was punished for that, but humans couldn't unlearn how to sacrifice things or how to burn things with fire.
Isn't there a theory in psychology, or neuropsychology, that the reason why we are so big brainy, clever clogs species is because we cooked and ate meat, which preserved more nutrients, or the proteins in it were better for brain development over a period of a few million years. So you can't have one Nando's and be, IQ 140, but over 2 million years, that's pretty good.
It is cool that there's that sort of collective memory in mythology that, it's only now that we have this sort of psychoanalytical understanding that we know exactly how the consumption of meat affects brain development. But in the past, they just sort of had this collective memory that cooking meat was good for their ancestors, and then they create that into a story. I think that's sort of a really beautiful way of expressing human progress.
Yeah, absolutely, Xenia. It's actually something that comes up a lot in Greek epic, and food scenes come up a lot, particularly in the Iliad. Part of it is because epic storytelling is an oral tradition, which means that people have to perform it, and that means that people have to remember it. Essentially, it's easier to remember things that are very repetitive for performances, which is kind of the same reason it's easier to remember the lyrics to like Hey Jude than it is to a kind of less catchy Beatles song. So one of these repetitive elements that they'd always talk about would be kind of descriptions of food. It would be right from the kind of slaughtering of the animal to the kind of roasting it and then ripping it up into strips and then eating it. And that would come up kind of quite a lot in these ancient stories, which is kind of a real ritual cultural behavior that is important to people, as I think food is in almost all cultures, really.
So I went to a place in Greece that's thought to be Nestor's palace, Nestor being one of the characters in Homer's epics, like he's in both the Odyssey and the Iliad. Anyway, we sat down there and we read the bit in the Odyssey where Nestor gets a cow. He's hosting a guest and he gets a cow, and it describes in so much detail how he kills it and how he roasts it. And the description is almost like he's going a bit OTT. The guest is sort of like, oh my gosh, I don't really know what to do. I'm feeling a little bit awkward. There's so much ceremony being put on for me. And he's asked to take a bath in the Queen's bath at one point, and he feels a bit awkward about that.
I wanted to ask, because you were talking about kind of guest relationships and hosts preparing food for guests, which is actually the concept of Xenia, which is your namesake, I guess.
I don't know. It's a bit of like an after the fact type thing, because my parents didn't study Latin or Greek, and they didn't know about Xenia, about the sort of Greek idea of guest friendship. But then when I started studying classics, I came across this and I was like, oh my gosh, wow, this is me, this is my name. But yes, I'm afraid there's a word for it, isn't it? That means sort of after the fact, or like
anachronistic.
There you go.
Good one.
Yeah.
That's a Greek word, a good Greek word.
There's a competing theory then that would explain how you came to be attracted to it, called nominative determinism.
Oh yeah, I've heard of this. So if your name is something like so and so king, you're more likely to have a higher position of power in your job. Or if you're called Joy Desperate, then you're more likely to be a really desperate, pitiful woman. Is that what you mean, Barney? I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's the way that you consider your own name may change the way that you act around anything associated with it, I think. The best example of that is Will Self, who's got quite a lot to say about how the two elements of his name interact with philosophical concepts that have driven his like career of criticism, the will and the self. So yeah, he's well in with it.
Unrelated, I will be changing my name by deed poll to Nando's Eater lottery winner.
Be the change you want to see, Flo.
Can we maybe explain a little bit more about what xenia is? In Greek thought, it's this kind of concept of guest friendship or like hospitality, and not in a kind of corporate hospitality way, in a kind of low-key inviting someone into your house, making them a nice meal and kind of letting them stay the night. But it's really interesting because xenia is really important because it kind of comes from this concept that you don't know who the guest could be. It could be a god or a goddess in disguise for all you know. So you better be kind to anyone who kind of shows up on your doorstep, just in case, basically. And it was a really important concept because the patron god of Xenia was Zeus. He's the king of the gods, who also might be your guest in disguise. It's impossible to say.
Feels quite surveillance heavy, that, doesn't it? Like you're sort of self-surveilling, and that you never know who's watching. You never know whether Zeus is there in the room with you.
I would find that really intimidating. I'm not great with hosting as it is. We've got like 3 plates. All of them are chipped. I'd probably get cursed immediately. I'd be like, I've got some leftover cheese and crackers from Christmas. I could probably do some Marmite on toast or garum on toast. I could probably whip that up.
The Romans would enjoy that. You'd be a very good host to Romans.
Yeah, and we could eat lying down watching Netflix. It'd be perfect.
There is this really cool text called, it's actually called the Satyricon, but it often gets called Trimalchio's Feast. And it's basically how not to have a dinner party. It's this critique of a guy who's having a dinner party and he's doing everything a little bit OTT, a little bit too much, a little bit like it's quite cringeworthy.
I did The Great Gatsby at A-level English, and it used to be, or has the subtitle of something like the Trimalchio of West Egg, which is like where Gatsby lives. And it's, I didn't realise The Great Gatsby is basically completely based on this ancient Roman text by Petronius, which is really cool.
There's a role that appears in Babylonian literature called the Aluzinu, this kind of jester type figure basically, and one of these jesters in one of these texts is listing all of these like nonsense dishes, and at one point he says, you shall eat the egg of a goose from the poultry house resting on a bed of sand and a decoration of Euphratean seaweed, which to me sounds like something that you could legit pass off on MasterChef or something like that, but it's nice to see that they kind of have a sense of humor around their food as well.
That's so cool. I think it means we have to be quite careful as well when we're looking at ancient texts and making sure that we're aware, like, what is a joke? Sometimes we get quite carried away with like looking at ancient texts and trying to reconstruct and trying to work out what life was like in the ancient world. But I think we do always run the risk of taking things a bit too seriously, especially when they're deliberately trying to mock something. I guess, Alison, you must come across this all the time in comedy, ancient comedy.
This is basically what I'm doing my PhD on. If we're looking at comedy, we can probably assume there are going to be a few jokes in there. Whereas if we're looking at like literally an old recipe book, they're probably not having you on, but maybe they are. Maybe it's a comedy recipe book. We'll never truly know. And that's part of the fun.
Great. So what have we all learned about food in the ancient world today?
I was stunned to find out that the link between Turkey the food and Turkey the country exists.
Unless you're French.
Yes, true.
Yeah, I loved finding out where chickens come from and where everyone thought they came from, which is even better. That's such a cool fact.
I cannot believe that the ancient Romans used to get stew as takeaway in a pottery bowl that they then threw against the wall or in a corner. That's wild to me, and I love that.
I really liked thinking about cooking, and as it appears in the myth of Prometheus, and what kind of what that represents about human memory and understanding of just basic activities like feeding yourself. I think that's really fascinating. Well, I hope you're all stuffed on facts about food in the ancient world, but join us next time where we'll be treading on eggshells around a very sensitive and important topic, the inauguration in the United States. In honour of that, we're going to be looking at democracy in the ancient world and the development of different systems of political government. So join us then.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed it, hit follow or subscribe so you'll get all our future episodes in your feed. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch with suggestions and feedback on Twitter @AgainstLaw, that's LORE, or email againstthelaw podcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.